Okay, thank you. Yes. Somebody yesterday referred to himself as a digital Neanderthal, which puts me somewhere back with the apes. So all I have here is one map to orient people as to the area I'm talking about. Beginning in 1993, my research on social and economic history of the 20th century in West Africa has focused on the Asante region of Ghana, this modern administrative region, which straddles the sort of humid rainforest belt of the south, especially southwestern part of Ghana, and a transitional zone into the savanna country of the central part of the national territory. The forests have figured centrally in the history of Asante and Ghana more broadly as a source of livelihood and wealth, as a central terrain, a kind of social source of social and spiritual power, and a territory that has been competed over by various governing authorities. And it's also figured in the historical representations and interpretations that Ghanaians and others have brought to bear on the understanding of their own changing circumstances in different historical periods. And I am particularly interested in the way in which processes of historical interpretation, I prefer this term to historical imagination because it's often quite purposeful and directed, have played into struggles over land, resources, and governing authority, particularly over the course of the long 20th century. For Asante, which was occupied by a British military force in 1896, this spans the colonial and the post-colonial periods. The role of the forests in the economic history of Asante is very important. The Asante itself grew out of a number of small polities founded by people who migrated from further south, closer to the coast, into what were then, by all accounts, dense rainforest cover in the 15th through 17th centuries, developed an economy that was based on a combination of forest agriculture, trade, and increasingly from the late 17th century on, when the core of the later Asante state was founded, through a process of military conquest incorporating more and more long-distance trade in forest commodities, gold, and slaves into kind of building up the economy of the Asante heartland. And at its zenith in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Asante monarchy, headquartered here in this region, controlled all of what is now the present-day territory of Ghana and some areas on the outsides of the borders as well. Its power declined through a series of internal conflicts in the late 19th century and then fell under British colonial rule from the mid-1890s. During the colonial era, forest resources played a central role in the colonial economy. By 1911, Ghana had emerged as the world's leading supplier of cocoa. Most of it grown, the actual predominant variety was originally imported into West Africa from the Amazon, and it flourished best when cultivated in partially cleared old-growth forests. So over the course of the 20th century, really extending right up until very recent times, the cultivation of cocoa spread from the forested areas in the southeast westward into the very rich, dense forests of this part of the country, and resulted in a long-term process of at least partial forest clearing. So the spread of cocoa clearly contributed to the decline of forest cover. James and Melissa and others have debated about the extent of that decline, but it did decline. And particularly following the Second World War, recovery of world commodity markets in the late 1940s and after, timber cutting expanded as a very important secondary source of export income. And there's also been small-scale production of gold that originates in the forest areas on and off for much of the 20th century. The economic interests that different actors, the colonial and post-colonial states, commercial logging companies, cocoa marketing firms, but also the thousands and thousands of farmers who were the principal producers of cocoa, and in more recent years, as some of the other papers have described in the Amazon, people have kind of diversified into small-scale, often illegal forms of timber cutting and forest extraction. And what really I would like to emphasize for purposes of this talk is the kind of ambivalence or tension that it seems to me characterizes the interests, simply the economic interests of every one of these categories of actors with regard to the forests, and it simply revolves very basically around the issue of, do we exploit them now or do we exploit them later? In other words, I think everybody from the state right down to ordinary villagers recognizes the value of protecting or replenishing the stock of forest resources for the future, but the pressures on people to exploit them now and derive profit, and in the case of the state, royalties, have been intense. So the kind of interplay of those interests has led, I think, to a progressive decline in the overall extent of forest cover, but also has played very significantly into the whole history of what might be thought of as both layered, but also competing claims to political power and authority throughout the colonial and post-colonial periods. Economic and political contests over the control of forest resources and the control of forested territory in Ghana have continually drawn on and refigured understandings of the past and how stories about histories of establishing claim over land and forest resources attached to the land figure in contemporary debates over both conservation policy, over forest exploitation, and in some ways above and beyond all in the continual competition over access to land, which in Ghana, as I think Susanna mentioned with respect to El Salvador yesterday and in other parts of the world as well, has become as important, if not more important, as a kind of asset, something in which to put whatever economic resources you have for the future as it is as a resource to be used for current production and income generation. And let me just give you a couple of brief examples of how invocations and interpretations of the past figure in all kinds of contemporary contexts that you might not expect them. I did a small restudy of a peri-urban community on the outskirts of Kumasi, the regional capital, a few years ago. And while I was working in this community over the course of several weeks, a discussion came up. The chief in the local area, and I'll say more about the traditional authorities in a moment, had realized that the town, which had been growing quite rapidly through basically a big housing boom in the period since the late 1990s, was running out of space in the town cemetery. And if it filled up completely, he was going to have to allocate more land in the area under his jurisdiction, which would mean he couldn't sell that off for building plots. So he announced that in keeping with Asante traditions, people should stop burying their dead in cement tombs in this cemetery and revert to the traditional practice of simply laying bodies in the earth in a sacred grove, a little area of forest preserved on the outskirts of human settlement and used, among other things, as a burial ground. So the town residents listened to this edict on his part, waited a couple of weeks out of respect, and then went to see him and said, but, you know, times have changed. Most of us are Christians. Christian cemeteries, people erect permanent grave markers and build cement tombs. And anyway, people move so widely these days that unless there's some kind of permanent marker for our children and grandchildren to come back to, how will they know their ancestors? And so in this case, the chief, rather than make a big issue of it, just said, okay, I'll rescind the ban and you can go ahead and build cement tombs. But it's a very small scale example of how the kind of multiple significances of forests play in sometimes quite surprising ways into contemporary struggles over land and authority. More broadly, this incident in which the chief plays a significant role in trying to shift the pattern of land use in this particular case reflects a land tenure situation that dates certainly to the early colonial period in this part of Ghana, in which land is subject to multiple layered claims. For a whole series of historical reasons I won't bother you with, traditional Asante chiefs have managed to extend their authority over the allocation of land to the point where Asante laws, the Constitution, and the courts now interpret their authority as amounting to holding a lodial title to the land, which means ultimate. In principle, land cannot be alienated. A great many traditional chiefs have indeed sold off large amounts of land under their jurisdiction. And people have not exactly objected to their authority to do that, which is in a way recognized by law. But rather, this has generated a whole series of local level struggles over what the chiefs do with the money they make by selling land. Is this their personal income, or should it be a public resource on behalf of the community? And that's a fight that's been going on since the end of the 19th century in various forms. The political economy of forest management then turns on a whole series of intersecting struggles over forest access, but also forest regulation and the division of what might be called forest rent. This is a term that was coined in the early 90s by a French anthropologist actually working next door in Côte d'Ivoire to refer to the income that has been generated over much of the 20th century from a kind of natural dividend. The cultivation of crops like cocoa really depended for the amount of yield and income that they generated on exploiting the kind of accumulated rich resources of the soils under old growth forests. And then timber and gold and other kinds of extraction of forest products have added to that. And what I would like to emphasize is that in this context of sort of multiple layered claims on land, increasing demand for land, rising land values have fed an ongoing process of competition that has not only tended to sort of intensify and reproduce multiple claims on land, but it's also generated multiple claims on the authority to decide whose claims on land are with merit and how they should be applied in reference to present sources. Another quick anecdote, I was doing some work in a rural town about 50 kilometers east of Kumasi a few years ago, and was walking through town one day and came across this huge pile of sort of roughly cut slabs out of the enormous trunks of hardwood timber, old-growth timber, that figured prominently at that time in the timber export business. And there were a bunch of people sitting around, and I was looking at this curiously and was about to walk away, and then I thought, hey, wait a minute. There's an office of the forestry department a quarter of a mile away at the other edge of town. These timber chunks are piled up in front of the chief's palace. So I asked people, what happened? You know, what are these doing here? Oh, somebody was trying to move them without a permit. And, you know, he was caught and they were impounded. So I thought a minute more and I said, who impounded them? And people said, oh, it was the chief's forest guards, which is just sort of opened my eyes to the existence of this whole shadow bureaucracy of kind of informal regulatory authority, which indeed plays into the kind of ongoing political economy of control over resources and over land as an asset as well as a current resource that figures very prominently indeed in the whole way in which Ghana and its resources and its people are governed. And this raises all kinds of questions. Not only what are the extent, what are the kind of limits to chiefly authority, about which the Constitution is very brief, so most of it is kind of worked out in practice and centers around struggles over land. But it also, I think, has played very much into the whole impact of neoliberal policy interventions, beginning with programs of market deregulation and liberalization in the 1980s, and then expanding into efforts to restructure Ghanaian and other African governments in the 1990s, first by promoting a transition from authoritarian to multi-party elected regimes, and Ghana went through such a successful transition in 1992. Yes. Through efforts on the part of advocates of neoliberal policy and their implementers to try to strengthen tenure security by giving legal recognition to rights of ownership and assigning this to particular owners, individuals, and in some cases, increasingly communities of various kinds. Okay, in a context in which you've already got multiple competing claims to land and to the authority to decide how these claims are to be resolved, the effort to go in, register, create a kind of definitive record of who owns land and who doesn't, has, it seems to me, simply raised the stakes in competition and raised the stakes in being able to invoke and make a convincing case that your claims are founded on ancient historical precedent that trump more recently established ones. And so ironically, the whole one of the important directions of neoliberal policy interventions in Ghana has been, if anything, to kind of promote and accentuate not only the proliferation of claims on land and claims on governing authority, but also the way in and the degree to which people keep invoking not just events of the last 20 or 50 years since independence, but going back to the founding of the Asante state at the end of the 17th century in contemporary contests over land and power, and these dynamics, I think, form a very important part of the kind of contemporary political and economic context that plays into forest management.
Perfect. Oh, wow, what timing. Do we have any questions? Thank you. Can you come over here?
This might be way off, but don't jump on me, I'm just an undergraduate. But I've heard some things about the interest in Ghana's forests from the pharmaceutical industry for traditional medicines. And I guess one thing that no one really talked about was intellectual property, because I'm sure it's a whole separate thing in itself. But I was wondering if that was something that was involved with your studies.
Yeah, I think certainly Ghanaians have become very interested in the whole issue of intellectual property as one other set of possible kind of legal sanctions to bring to bear on competing claims to different kinds of forest resources, of which pharmaceutical uses would be one example. And my sort of general response to that, I haven't followed the debates in Ghana specifically over issues of intellectual property, that this adds just another layer of possible debate, that people can invoke intellectual property rights, but then when you get into questions of, all right, so whom do those rights belong to? It's all very well to say they belong to Ghanaians, or even, and this it seems to me is in some ways more significant, efforts to say they belong to particular local communities, then get you into an absolute hornet's nest of questions about what is the community. How are communities governed, in many cases, as in Asante, with this whole long history of kind of entrenched or institutionalized chiefly power? It's very hierarchical, although also contested. But then there's also a really interesting and complicated set of questions about who belongs to a community. English speakers in Ghana use the term citizenship in a double way. It refers to their legal and political rights as citizens of the nation of Ghana. But people also talk about people being citizens of their local area of origin. And when you begin asking what defines a local area of origin, it comes back to the history of people's forebears' relationships with the holder of chieftaincy authority in that particular region. So this is another way in which historical narratives are constantly being invoked and reinterpreted, and ultimately feed into something like debates over intellectual property rights in the context of pharmaceutical interest in forests. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was just wondering if one of our sites is in Ghana, and getting into these issues. I had heard, but I haven't read it yet, that given the fact that the chiefs are so powerful, and that the difference from allocating rights to actually assuming ownership rights of land had gotten so out of hand that there was, and I think it's unique in Western and Central Africa, that there was an attempt to bring them together, the chiefs together in a body of chieftainship, instrumented, I don't know by who, but by the state, to begin to discuss democratization, a Western contemporary sense of democratization in the realm of chief authority, to try to loosen it a little bit, to get some discussion going. Can you just tell, if you know about it, I'd be interested in how it plays out.
I mean, I think people are continually kind of picking up on new discourses of political legitimacy, with democracy figuring very centrally, not only in the arguments and the sort of organizational efforts that the state is bringing to bear on chiefly power, but chiefs themselves use this very effectively. And Right. I mean, you know, these guys are old hands at this business. They've been dealing with British colonial authorities and running circles around them. And what seems to me to have happened since at the time of independence, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who was very well known as a kind of icon of not only national independence, but real social transformation and breaking from the colonial past, pretty much stripped Ghanaian chiefs of all of the legal and judicial prerogatives they had held under colonial rule, except their authority over the allocation of land. And Nkrumah, but even more, many of his less sort of popular, well-established successors have really vacillated between worrying about the chiefs as rivals to state power and wanting to court their support for whatever kind of public following they can command. And this, I think, sort of combined with the progressively increasing intensity of competition over land has given chiefs a platform from which to expand their power in all kinds of both public and informal ways. And it's fascinating because you hear a tremendous amount of popular criticism just from ordinary citizens about the way the chiefs abuse and exploit their power. But at the same time, there is this kind of tremendous sense of almost pride invested in Ghanaian history and Ghanaian tradition. And let me just illustrate that with a quote from an article, not by me, unfortunately, by an anthropologist named Gracia Clark, who teaches at Indiana University, who was winding up a year of field research in Kumasi back in 95 or 96, and describes a conversation with her auto mechanic in which he was, you know, being sort of flattering as she was leaving and said to her, "After all the research that you've done here in Kumasi, you know more about Asante than Ghanaians who emigrated and have lived abroad. They know what we used to do 10 to 20 years ago when they left, but you know the very latest tradition."
Thank you so much.